For Christmas, my son said, "This time we're celebrating without you. My wife doesn't want to see you." I silently nodded and stopped paying for their house rent. A month later, they burst into my house and... Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I turned 68 the September before everything fell apart, and I spent that birthday the same way I'd spent most of my recent years, doing something for my son. I baked a pie, apple, the kind Daniel always loved. I drove it 40 minutes across town to the house I was paying for, set it on the counter of the kitchen I'd helped furnish, and ate a slice alone at the table while Daniel took a work call in the other room, and his wife, Brianna, scrolled her phone on the couch without once looking up. That was my birthday. I drove home in the dark listening to the radio, and I told myself, this is what love looks like sometimes. Quiet, unglamorous, real. I want you to understand what things were like before, not to make you feel sorry for me. I've never been a woman who wanted pity, but because the story only makes sense if you know where it started. Daniel was my only child. His father, Robert, passed 11 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you should have said years earlier. After Robert died, I threw myself into work. I was a licensed real estate agent for 31 years, and I was good at it. I understood property. I understood contracts. I understood what things were worth. When Daniel married Brianna 6 years ago, I tried to love her. I genuinely tried. She was pretty in a sharp, careful way, with long nails always painted and a smile that arrived slightly too late, like she had to remember to put it on. Daniel was 34, she was 29, and they were, as far as I could tell, happy enough. The financial arrangement began innocently. Daniel had been laid off during a bad quarter at his tech company, and Brianna was working part-time at a boutique that paid almost nothing. They needed a place to live. I owned a rental property, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in a decent neighborhood, and rather than put strangers in it, I told Daniel he and Brianna could live there. I charged them $800 a month. The market rate was $2,200. Just until you get back on your feet, I said. Daniel got back on his feet within 8 months. He found a new job, a better one. His salary climbed. Brianna stopped working entirely. The $800 a month never changed. Neither did my expectation that it would. I told myself I was being generous. I was being a mother. Over the next 5 years, I also helped with the car payment twice. I paid for a vacation to Mexico when Brianna said she needed a break. I bought the living room furniture when she said the old set was embarrassing. I paid for the fertility consultations when they were trying to conceive, though that, at least, Daniel had asked for personally, with real emotion in his voice, and I hadn't hesitated. I kept a ledger. Not obsessively, not with resentment, just because I was an organized woman. By the time Christmas of that year arrived, I had given or subsidized over 5.5 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of $87,000. But I am getting ahead of myself. The first sign that something had shifted came in early autumn. I called Daniel on a Sunday afternoon, the way I always did, and Brianna answered his phone. She told me he was busy. I asked if everything was all right. There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. And she said, "Fine," in a tone that meant the opposite. When Daniel called back an hour later, he sounded strained. He said Brianna had been stressed. He said she needed space. I asked what I had done, and he said, "Nothing, Mom. Just give her some room." I gave her room. I stopped dropping by unannounced, something I had done perhaps once a month before. I started texting before calling. I brought fewer things over. No more casseroles left on the porch. No more small gifts I thought she might like. I contracted myself the way women of my generation were trained to do when we sensed we were too much. It didn't help. In November, Daniel canceled our standing Sunday dinner, then again the week after. When I finally saw him for coffee in early December, he looked tired in a way I recognized. Not physical tiredness, but the tiredness of a man being pulled in two directions and choosing, quietly, one of them. I didn't say anything. I drank my coffee and asked about his work and drove home wondering what I had missed and when I had missed it. Then came Christmas. I arrived at the house with gifts and a dish of sweet potatoes and my good coat, the navy one I kept for occasions. Daniel opened the door. He looked at me for a moment just long enough to tell me what was coming, and then he said it. "Mom," his voice was low, "this year we're doing Christmas without you. Brianna doesn't want you here." I stood on the porch I had paid for. I looked at my son. I thought of the apple pie I had baked alone on my birthday, and the ledger in the drawer at home, and the 31 years of knowing what things were worth. I nodded. I said nothing. I picked up my dish of sweet potatoes, turned around, and walked back to my car. I didn't cry until I reached the end of the block. And even then, it wasn't grief exactly. It was something colder. Something that felt, for the first time, like clarity. I drove home in that same navy coat, and I did not take it off when I got inside. I sat down at the kitchen table in my coat with the dish of sweet potatoes in front of me, and I stayed there for a long time. My house was quiet in the way that a house becomes quiet after decades of living alone in it. Not empty, exactly, but settled into its own particular silence. The refrigerator hummed. The heat clicked on. Outside, a neighbor's child was shrieking with laughter about something, and that small, bright sound from someone else's life made the silence around me more complete. I am not a woman who spirals. I never have been. Robert used to say I was the most even-keeled person he'd ever met, which was sometimes a compliment, and sometimes, I understood, a complaint. But that night, sitting at that table, I let myself feel it fully. The rejection, the humiliation, the specific and particular sting of being turned away from a door I owned. Because I did own it. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. The house was in my name. I had transferred the deed to my rental property, the Craftsman on Elmwood, into a family trust 7 years ago on the advice of my estate attorney. But I remained the trustee. Every month, $800 came into an account I managed, and every month I paid the property tax, the insurance, the maintenance. When the water heater failed 2 years ago, I replaced it. When the roof needed patching, I hired the roofers. Daniel had thanked me each time. Brianna had said nothing. I went to my desk. I opened the bottom left drawer, the one I called my serious drawer, and I took out the ledger. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. Over 5 years and 7 months, I had contributed the following. Subsidized rent totaling roughly $83,000 in market rate difference. Direct cash gifts or loans of $11,400. Furniture, appliances, and household goods valued at approximately $4,200. Medical and consultation fees of $3,100. The total, when I added it carefully with a pencil, came to $101,700. $101,000. I sat with that number for a while. It didn't make me angry, not in the hot way I think people expect. It made me tired. And underneath the tiredness, yes, fear. Because what the number revealed was not just what I had given, but how much of my sense of connection had been built on what I was giving. If I took the money away, what was left? Was there a relationship there, or had I simply been funding the illusion of one? That was the fear. Not financial fear. I was not a wealthy woman, but I was a careful one, and I had enough. The fear was of the answer to that question. The fear of standing in the rubble of something you built and realizing it was never what you thought. But here is what I have learned in 68 years. Fear, if you don't let it paralyze you, can be useful fuel. I made tea. I sat back down, and I began to think. The most important thing I understood, because I had spent 31 years in real estate and I knew contracts and I knew leverage, was that I had a significant and legal power that I had simply been choosing not to use. The house on Elmwood was mine. Daniel and Brianna had no lease. I had never drawn one up because he was my son, and you don't give your son a lease, do you? I had thought at the time that the absence of paperwork was an act of trust. I understood now that it had also been an act of exposure, on both sides. They had no lease, which meant legally they were month-to-month tenants, which meant that in the state where we lived, I could issue a 30-day notice to vacate, provided I followed the correct procedure. I knew the procedure. I had served notices before on other tenants in other years. It was not complicated. I was not going to be impulsive. I was not going to act from rage. I was going to act from the same place I had always acted when I sat across from a client in a difficult transaction, clear-eyed, informed, and certain of what I was doing and why. The plan, when it came to me, was not dramatic. It was simply this. I would stop paying for things I was not welcome to share in. I would notify the property management trust that the subsidy was ending. Daniel and Brianna would receive a letter, formal, legal, correct, informing them that beginning the first of the following month, rent would reflect market rate, $2,200 a month. And if they could not or would not pay it, the 30-day process would begin. I also decided I would tell no one, not my friend Carol, not my sister Joan in Phoenix, not my attorney yet, not until the letter was sent. Because I knew how these things went. Someone would say, "Are you sure?" Someone would say, "He's your son, Margaret." And I was not interested in being talked out of clarity by someone else's sentimentality. I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I put the sweet potatoes in the refrigerator, where I would eat them alone over the next 3 days, which was fine. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in the middle of the night. The letter went out on December 28th, 3 days after Christmas. I drafted it myself, then read it twice, then called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Shen, who had handled my estate planning and 2 previous tenant disputes, and read it to her over the phone. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "It's solid, Margaret. Clean. I'd add 1 line about the notice period and reference the state statute, just to make it airtight." I added the line. I printed the letter on plain paper, signed it, and sent it certified mail. Return receipt requested. The letter stated the following. Effective February 1st, the monthly rent for the property at 412 Elmwood Drive would increase to $2,200 per month, reflecting current market rate. It further stated that in the event the new rent was not paid by the 5th of the month, a formal 30-day notice to vacate would be issued in accordance with state tenancy law. I did not mention Christmas. I did not mention Brianna. I did not mention the $101,000. The letter was about rent and only rent, because that was the only thing I needed it to be about. Then I waited. The return receipt came back on December 30th. Someone had signed for it. The signature was Brianna's. I filed the receipt in my serious drawer and went to make lunch. For the first few days of January, nothing happened. I went about my life. Groceries, a walk each morning, an afternoon with Carol, where I said nothing about any of it and instead listened to her talk about her grandchildren. I watched the news. I read. I slept well. Then, on January 4th, Daniel called. "Mom." His voice was different from Christmas, tighter. "Did you send us a letter?" "I did," I said. "About rent?" "That's right." A long pause. "I don't understand. We've been paying $800 a month for years." "You have," I said. "And I've been subsidizing the rest. I've decided to stop doing that." Another pause. When he spoke again, I could hear something behind the tightness. Something that might have been calculation. "Is this about Christmas?" Because it's about rent, I said. The letter explains everything. If you have questions about the legal specifics, Patricia Shen's contact information is at the bottom. I ended the call politely. My hands were steady. Over the next week, I noticed things. Small things, but I noticed them because I was paying attention in a way I hadn't been before. Daniel called twice more. Once to say they needed more time. Once to say that $2,200 was unreasonable and I was being vindictive. I listened to both calls and said the same thing. The letter was accurate. The timeline was as stated. And if he wanted to discuss it further, he was welcome to do so through Patricia. What I hadn't expected was Brianna. She did not call me. She texted Daniel while he was sitting across from me at the one brief coffee meeting I agreed to in mid-January, and I saw, not deliberately, but I saw, the screen of his phone when a message came in. He moved to angle it away, but not quite fast enough. The message read, "Does she know about the loan from your dad's account?" I said nothing. I looked at my coffee. I filed the sentence away in the part of my mind where I kept things that needed to be examined carefully later. Robert had died 11 years ago. His estate had been modest. A savings account, a small IRA, a life insurance policy. Everything had gone through probate properly. I was the sole beneficiary. There was no ambiguity in the distribution, and there was certainly no outstanding loan. But the word loan stayed with me, and the fact that Brianna had brought it up as a tactical question, "Does she know?" told me something I hadn't known before. It told me that there was something to know. That evening, I pulled out Robert's estate file. I keep meticulous records. My father was an accountant, and I grew up understanding that paper trails matter. I went through every document. The probate filings, the bank statements from the transition period, the IRA distribution confirmation. Everything was in order. And then I found something I had not looked at closely enough when I filed it. A withdrawal notification from Robert's savings account, dated 4 months before his death, during a period when he had been ill, and I had been managing his care almost entirely for $12,000. The payee line read, D. Calloway. Daniel. Robert had been ill. His memory had not been sharp in those final months, and Daniel had been there often, visiting, helpful in the practical ways a son can be. Picking up prescriptions, handling calls. I had been grateful for that. I had never questioned it. I sat very still at my desk for a long time. I did not have proof that the money had been taken without proper consent. I did not have proof of anything yet. What I had was a withdrawal I had never known about, and a text message from my daughter-in-law asking whether I was aware of it. Not out of guilt, but out of strategy. That was the moment. Sitting at my desk with Robert's estate file open in front of me, $12,000 on a withdrawal slip, and the cold and absolute certainty that the people I had been subsidizing for 5.5 years knew something about Robert's money that they had never told me. I picked up the phone and called Patricia Shen. "Patricia," I said, "I need to add something to what we're working on, and I think I need to move carefully." Patricia moved carefully. That was what I had asked for, and she delivered. Within 2 days of my call, she had contacted the bank where Robert's savings account had been held, the same institution where I still kept my own accounts, and submitted a formal records request for all transactions during the 18 months before Robert's death. She explained to me that because I had been the sole beneficiary of the estate and the account had been jointly titled in our names during the marriage, I had the standing to request those records. It would take time, she said, 2 weeks, possibly 3, but we would have them. In the meantime, the February rent was coming due. On February 1st, I checked the account. $800 appeared, not $2,200. $800, the old amount, paid with what I could only read as deliberate defiance. They knew I had received the notification. They had chosen to ignore it. I called Patricia. She said what I expected her to say. This triggered the next step. She filed the formal 30-day notice to vacate on February 2nd, served by a process server to the property address at 412 Elmwood. Legal, correct, documented. The notice was served on a Tuesday. By Thursday evening, I heard a car in my driveway that I recognized, Daniel's gray Hyundai. And then the doorbell, and then fists. Not knocking. Fists. I looked through the window before I opened the door. Both of them were there. Daniel's face was flushed in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager getting caught in a lie. Brianna stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, and her expression was the opposite of his. Not flushed, not loud, but watching, calculating. I opened the door. "You can't do this," Daniel said. He did not say hello. He did not say mom. "I've done it correctly," I said. "Everything is legal and documented. If you'd like to come in and speak calmly, I'm willing to do that. If you'd like to stand on the porch like this, I'm going to close the door." He came in. Brianna followed. I did not offer them anything, not water, not a seat at first, not the reflexive hospitality I'd been offering them for 6 years. I led them to the living room, and I sat down in Robert's armchair, the one I never usually used, and I waited. What followed was approximately 45 minutes that I will not dramatize because the details were ugly in a small, domestic way. Daniel said I was being vindictive. I said I was exercising a legal right as a property owner. He said I was punishing them for Christmas. I said the rent increase was unrelated to Christmas, and that if he'd like to contest that, he was welcome to try in housing court where a judge would review the math. Brianna said very little for the first half of the conversation, which I noticed and found more unnerving than Daniel's volume. Then near the end, Brianna spoke. "You should know," she said, in a tone so measured it felt rehearsed, "that Daniel told me about the money, the $12,000 his father gave him. And if you decide to make this into something bigger than it is, we'll tell everyone that you knew about it and you've been holding it over him for years." I looked at her. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it matters. It was not panic. It was not even anger. It was the feeling of watching a hand of cards get laid face up on the table and recognizing that the person laying them down doesn't actually understand what she's holding. "Robert's account records have already been requested," I said, "through my attorney. If Daniel received that money as a legitimate gift, there will be documentation. If there isn't, that will also be clear." I paused. "And I'd encourage you to think very carefully before accusing me of knowing about a transaction I never knew occurred. That is a serious claim." Brianna's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. The calculation became something else. Uncertainty. Daniel stood up. "We're not leaving the house," he said. "You'll have to take us to court." "That's your right," I said. "The process is already in motion. Patricia Shen's number is on the notices you received." They left, not storming. Daniel tried to slam the door, but then seemed to think better of it and closed it with exaggerated care, which was somehow worse. I stood in my own living room and listened to his car back out of my driveway. Then I sat down in Robert's armchair again. My heart was beating harder than I wanted it to. My hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. I gave myself the rest of that evening to simply be still. I made soup, canned tomato, the plain kind, the kind I'd eaten since I was a child, and that still seemed to me the simplest kindness you could do for yourself. I ate it at the kitchen table. I watched a program I don't remember now. I went to bed early. The next morning, I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She took notes. She said the threat Brianna had made about reputational damage was, in her assessment, empty, and potentially, if they pursued it publicly, actionable in the other direction. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days of soup and morning walks and not answering my phone if I didn't want to. I owed myself that much. On the 4th day, I came back to the desk, opened the serious drawer, and kept going. The bank records arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia called me while I was in the middle of replanting a small pot of herbs on the kitchen windowsill, rosemary that had been getting leggy. And I set it down and listened. The records showed 3 withdrawals from Robert's savings account in the 14 months before his death. The $12,000 I had found in my files. A second for $4,500 8 months prior. A third for $2,000, which I had not known about either. All 3 payable to D. Calloway. $18,500 in total. There was no written authorization, no gift documentation, no acknowledgement in the estate filings, which meant either Robert had given the money informally and without my knowledge, or someone had taken advantage of an ill man who had not been fully himself. Patricia explained the legal landscape to me plainly. We could not definitively prove intent at this point. What we had was a pattern of undisclosed withdrawals from a joint account during a period of documented illness, with no supporting paperwork. She recommended engaging a forensic accountant she worked with to prepare a formal report, which would be admissible if this ever needed to go further. She also recommended that I be very careful about who I spoke to and what I said until we understood the full picture. I thanked her and went back to the rosemary. I stood at the window for a long time after I hung up, watching a squirrel work its way across the fence line. $18,500. Taken or given without my knowledge while I was driving to and from the hospital, managing the insurance calls, learning how to navigate a world that was about to lose Robert. The number was not what made me cold. It was the silence around it. 11 years of silence. And then Brianna's voice in my living room. Does she know about the loan? Not a gift. A loan. Which meant they had a version of events in which this was legitimate, and which also meant they had been sitting on that version for years, saving it as a countermove. I was not shaking. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was the particular stillness that comes when you have been moving through fog and the fog lifts and you see the terrain exactly as it is. It is not comfortable, but it is solid. 2 days after the bank records arrived, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A text, brief. Margaret, this is Brianna. I think we should meet, just us. Talk woman to woman. I think we got off on the wrong foot and there's been a misunderstanding. I'd love to clear the air. Coffee? I read it twice. I set the phone down. I did not respond that day. The language was careful. Misunderstanding, wrong foot, clear the air. The vocabulary of someone extending an olive branch while holding something behind their back. I had been a real estate agent for 31 years. I had sat across from 100 people who wanted something from me and had learned to say misunderstanding instead. I knew what it sounded like. I did not respond to Brianna's text. Not that day, not the next. What I did instead was call Carol. Carol Hutchins had been my closest friend for 23 years. We had met at a neighborhood association meeting, bonded over our mutual impatience with a particular city councilman, and had been having lunch every few weeks ever since. She was 71, sharp, retired from 30 years as a high school principal, and she was one of the very few people I trusted to listen to a complicated thing without immediately telling me what to do about it. I drove to her house on a Friday afternoon, and I told her everything. The Christmas, the letter, the bank records, the living room confrontation, Brianna's text. Carol listened. She poured us both tea. She always had strong tea in the afternoon, a habit she'd picked up from a British teacher she'd worked alongside for 15 years, and she didn't say anything until I was finished. Then she said, "You've already done the hard part, Margaret. You just need to not be alone in it." She was right. That was exactly what I needed to hear, not because it was sentimental, but because it was practical. I had been moving through this alone, which had been necessary for a while, but isolation has its own costs. It narrows your vision. It lets the other side's narrative fill the space around yours. Carol offered two things. First, that she would be present, not as a witness to anything legal, just as a person who knew the facts, who I could talk to, who would remember what I said from week to week and hold me accountable to my own clarity. Second, that she had a nephew who practiced family law in a city 2 hours away, and that if the situation developed further, if Daniel chose to contest the estate withdrawals in a way that brought family litigation, she would connect me. I also called my sister Joan in Phoenix. Joan was 4 years younger than me, and we had not always been close, but she had known Robert well, and she had met Daniel's wife at the wedding and had said to me afterward, quietly, driving back to the hotel, "Be careful with that one, Maggie." I had dismissed it at the time. I called her now and I said, "Joan, you were right, and here's what happened." Joan said what Joan always said in moments of crisis, "Tell me what you need and I'll do it." I said, "I just need you to know." That was enough. That was the whole thing. Not to be managed, not to be fixed, just known. I returned home that Friday evening feeling different than I had in weeks. Not lighter, exactly. The weight of what I was carrying hadn't changed, but steadier. The weight was distributed now. Other people were holding the edges of it. Brianna's unanswered text sat on my phone. I looked at it one more time before I went to bed. I would let her wonder. That was, I had decided, the appropriate response for now. They came on a Sunday. Of course it was Sunday. The day I had always been most available, most domestic, most likely to have something warm on the stove. The day that for years had meant family. It was the second Sunday of February, about 10 days before the 30-day notice period would expire. I had just come back from my morning walk and was still in my coat when the car pulled up. This time, it was not fists on the door. This time, Daniel rang the bell and waited, and when I looked through the window, I saw that Brianna was carrying flowers, yellow tulips, my favorite. I had not known she knew that. I opened the door. "Mom." Daniel's voice was entirely different from the Thursday confrontation. Softer, almost the voice of the boy he had been at 14 when he'd come to me after breaking something he shouldn't have been touching. "We want to talk. Can we come in? Please." I looked at the tulips. I looked at Brianna, who was wearing less makeup than usual, and had arranged her expression into something I can only describe as vulnerable. Lips slightly pressed together, eyes soft, the practiced openness of a woman who has decided that warmth is the correct tactical choice. I let them in. I did not let the tulips change anything, but I accepted them, put them in water, and set them on the counter. I made coffee because I am not a cruel woman, and it was cold outside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat alone on my birthday, and I waited. Daniel spoke first. He said that they had both done a lot of thinking. He said he knew Christmas had been handled badly. Brianna pressed her lips together and nodded, and that he was sorry for how it had gone. He said he loved me, and that he didn't want to lose his mother over a landlord dispute. He used that phrase, landlord dispute, as if what was happening was a misunderstanding between strangers. I said, "I hear you, Daniel." Then Brianna spoke. She spoke carefully, in the tone of a woman who has rehearsed this, not robotically, but you could hear the seams if you were listening. She said she knew we had gotten off to a difficult start. She said she had perhaps been guarded with me, that she came from a family where in-law relationships were complicated, and that she had carried those patterns into our relationship unfairly. She used the word growth. She said she wanted to do better. Then she said, "And I think, in the spirit of starting fresh, it makes sense to let go of the legal stuff. Both sides. All of it." There it was. I set down my coffee cup. I looked at her. "Both sides," I said. "The rent thing," she said. And a small pause. Any other concerns that might have come up? I think family things should stay in the family, don't you? What she was offering me was this. They would accept a return to the old arrangement. $800 a month, no notice to vacate. In exchange for me dropping the inquiry into Robert's account. She was dressing it as reconciliation. It was a transaction. And she was telling me that she knew what Patricia had found, which meant that Daniel had told her, which meant they had been monitoring this situation more closely than their casual tone suggested. I thought of Carol's voice. You've already done the hard part. I thought of the squirrel on the fence, and the rosemary on the windowsill, and the 3 days of soup. I appreciate you both coming, I said. I mean that, but I'm not going to stop the legal process. The rent notice stands, and the records inquiry is a separate matter that I've placed in my attorney's hands. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, you're going to destroy this family over money. I'm not, I said. The decisions that were made destroyed things. I'm just responding to them accurately. Brianna's expression changed. The softness went away, not all at once, but like a light dimming. You realize, she said quietly, that if this goes further, Daniel will have to tell his version of the money. And his version is different from what you think you know. I'm sure it is, I said. That's what attorneys are for. She stood up first. Daniel looked at her, then at me, then back at her. And I watched him make the choice I had been watching him make for years. He stood up too. You're going to regret this, Brianna said. Not loudly, just plainly, like a weather forecast. Maybe, I said. I walked them to the door. I held it open. Drive safe. After the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a moment. And yes, I want to be honest. I felt afraid. The fear came in after the adrenaline, the way cold comes in after the wind. They would fight this. Brianna was not a stupid woman, which meant she was dangerous in the particular way that intelligent people are dangerous when they feel cornered. But underneath the fear, something else. A kind of bedrock. Because the truth was that I had nothing to hide, and they did. And in my experience, that asymmetry eventually tells. I went back to the kitchen. The yellow tulips were in the vase on the counter, and they were genuinely pretty. I kept them. I wasn't going to throw out flowers just because of who brought them. But I didn't change anything. The forensic accountant Patricia had engaged was a man named Howard Briggs. He had been doing estate and financial irregularity work for over 20 years, and when he sent me his preliminary report in the 3rd week of February, it was 11 pages of careful, documented language that said the same thing I already suspected, but in a way that would hold up. The 3 withdrawals from Robert's account, totaling $18,500, had occurred during a period the report characterized as one of documented diminished cognitive capacity, supported by Robert's own medical records from that period, which his primary care physician had provided through a formal records request. The withdrawals had no associated gift documentation, no promissory note establishing a loan, and had not been disclosed in the estate filings, which I had signed. The report concluded that the withdrawals raised significant questions of authorization and fiduciary appropriateness and recommended further review. That language, Howard explained, was the language that opened doors. Patricia submitted the report to an estate litigation attorney she worked with, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had 30 years of experience and a reputation for being extremely unpleasant to be across the table from. Sandra reviewed the report and said she was willing to take the case on contingency. I want to pause here and tell you what this moment felt like. Not dramatically, but accurately. It felt like something that had been leaning for a long time finally becoming vertical. The process had begun in loneliness, in a kitchen with sweet potatoes and a ledger and a very old and specific grief. It had moved, step by step, through letters and phone calls and a cup of coffee I had drunk while watching my son, choose Brianna's version of his life. And now it had arrived here. A table in Sandra Okafor's downtown office, 2 attorneys, a forensic report, and me in my good coat, the navy one. The 30-day notice expired without payment of market rent. Formal eviction proceedings were filed in housing court on March 3rd. Daniel and Brianna retained a tenants' rights attorney, a young man named Philip Carver, whom Patricia described to me later as earnest but outmatched. I never met him. The housing court date was set for late March, but the estate matter moved on a different and faster track because Sandra had found something Howard's preliminary report had noted but not fully developed: a 4th withdrawal. Smaller, $900. From a date 6 weeks before Robert died, when he had been at a point in his illness where, according to his physician's notes, he had intermittent capacity, requiring supervision for complex decisions. That 4th withdrawal, combined with the 3 larger ones, gave Sandra the pattern she needed. She sent a formal demand letter to Daniel, not through me, not casually, but through proper legal channels, on March 15th, requesting full repayment of the unauthorized withdrawals totaling $19,400 with applicable interest and reserving the right to pursue full estate litigation if repayment was not made within 30 days. I was not in the room when Daniel received that letter, but I heard about it. Carol called me 2 days later to say that apparently, because small towns have long lines of connection, Brianna had told a woman named Deanna, who was in Carol's water aerobics class, that Margaret Calloway was trying to destroy her son's life over a misunderstanding. Carol told me this without editorializing, the way she always gave me information she thought I needed. I wasn't going to respond to rumors. I had stopped doing that sometime in my 40s, and I saw no reason to start again. The housing court hearing was a Tuesday. Patricia accompanied me. Daniel and Brianna arrived with Philip Carver, who had prepared, I learned later, a defense based on the argument that as Daniel's mother, I had established a pattern of below-market rent that constituted an implied agreement. It was not a frivolous argument. It was the argument I had expected and that Patricia had prepared for. What Philip Carver had apparently not prepared for was Patricia's documentation. Every maintenance record, every property tax statement, every insurance payment, every repair invoice, going back 5.5 years. She presented these not as grievances, but as evidence of an active, ongoing landlord-tenant relationship in which rent had been explicitly established at $800 as a temporary arrangement. Her language, but supported by a text message from Daniel, sent in the first month of their occupancy, that read, "Thanks, Mom. We'll get back on our feet and start paying real rent once I'm working again." I had not been looking for that message. Patricia had found it when I gave her access to my phone records. Once I'm working again. He had been working for 5 years. The judge, a compact, unsmiling woman named Judge Andrea Pressman, reviewed the documentation and issued her ruling that afternoon. The original rent arrangement had been informal and had not constituted a binding lease obligation at below market rate. The market rate increase was valid. The eviction proceedings were lawful. Daniel and Brianna had 60 days to vacate 412 Elmwood Drive. I watched Brianna's face when Judge Pressman finished speaking. She had been composed the entire hearing, more composed than Daniel, who had visibly clenched his jaw during Patricia's presentation. But when the judge finished, something happened to Brianna's face that I had not seen before. It was not rage. It was not tears. It was the particular expression of a person who has miscalculated in a significant way and is now doing rapid, private arithmetic. Daniel turned to her. I saw him mouth something I couldn't hear. I did not look away from either of them. I had earned the right to watch. They did not vacate quietly, but they vacated. In the 60 days that followed Judge Pressman's ruling, I watched a kind of managed collapse. Philip Carver filed a motion to extend the timeline, which was denied. Daniel called me twice. Not Brianna, just Daniel. and both calls were different in tone from anything that had come before. The first was angry, still partly performing for an audience I couldn't see. The second was something else, quieter. He said, "Mom, I didn't know she was going to go at you like that." I said, "I know, Daniel." That was all. I didn't absolve him, because absolution was not mine to give yet, and I didn't condemn him either, because he was still my son, and I knew the specific complicated way that loving someone controlling can make you complicit in things you didn't entirely choose. The estate demand letter moved forward in parallel. Sandra Okafor was, as advertised, extremely unpleasant to be across from. Daniel's response through his own attorney, not Philip Carver, he found a different one for the estate matter, was that the money had been given as gifts, that Robert had been fully capable of authorizing them, and that I was engaging in a campaign of harassment. Sandra's response was the forensic report, the medical records establishing the timeline of cognitive decline, and a deposition notice for the bank teller who had processed the final 2 withdrawals. The deposition notice was, as far as I could tell, the moment the air went out of the balloon. I don't know exactly what was said in the back rooms between Daniel, Brianna, and their attorney during the 2 weeks that followed. What I know is that on a Tuesday in April, Sandra called me and said that Daniel had agreed, through counsel, to full repayment of the $19,400, with interest calculated from the date of each withdrawal, totaling $22,150. No admission of wrongdoing. His attorney had insisted on that, but full repayment. I thought about pushing for an admission. I thought about it seriously. Sandra said it was my call. I sat with it overnight and came back with an answer. No. Not because I was being kind to Daniel, but because the repayment was the substance of what mattered, and because dragging this into a full trial would take another year and cost me in ways that weren't only financial. I had my life to get back to. I had decided I was done letting this consume more of it than it already had. I accepted the settlement. The check arrived in Sandra's escrow account on May 2nd. The house at 412 Elmwood was vacated on May 7th. I drove past on the 8th, which I had specifically not done before, and I parked at the curb for a moment and looked at it. It was a good house. Craftsman bones, a big porch, a yard that needed a little work after years of not quite being cared for the way I would have. The rhododendron by the front walk had been overwatered and had root rot along one side. I made a note to have it looked at. I didn't go inside that day. I drove home. The following week, I had the property cleaned and professionally assessed. The damage was not severe. Some drywall scuffing, a bathroom tile that had cracked and not been reported, a gate in the backyard that had been broken and simply left broken. I had it all repaired. The total came to $2,400, which I deducted from the security deposit that I had in my original trust, never actually collected from my own son, which meant I paid for it myself. That was a consequence of my own sentimentality, and I noted it without self-pity and moved on. In June, I put 412 Elmwood on the rental market at $2,300 a month. The market had moved slightly in 6 months. Within 2 weeks, I had a new tenant, a woman named Diane, a school teacher, early 40s, 2 dogs, impeccable references. She paid her deposit and first month on time, signed a proper lease that Patricia had drafted, and moved in on a Saturday. I gave her a bottle of wine and a copy of the emergency contact procedures, and I left her to her life. The money from the estate settlement had, by then, arrived and been deposited. I did not do anything dramatic with it. I put most of it back into the same savings account I had always kept for property maintenance and emergencies, which seemed right. It was Robert's money, in a sense. It came back to where it belonged. I did take $300 and spend it on something I had been putting off for 2 years, a trip to the Botanical Garden 3 hours north, where I had always meant to spend a full day and never quite made the time. I drove up on a Wednesday in May, when it would be quiet, and I spent 5.5 hours walking through every section of it. I ate lunch alone at a cafe there. Something good. A proper lunch, not soup. And I sat in the sun by the rose garden for a long time after. Nobody needed anything from me that day. That was the whole of it. On the drive home, I thought about Daniel. Not with anger. The anger had done its work, and I had let it go, the way you let a fire go once it served its purpose. With something more like sorrow and watchfulness. He was my son. He had made choices I hadn't expected him to make. Whether we would find our way back to something real depended, I thought, on whether he was capable of honesty, with himself first, and then with me. I couldn't know that yet. So I left that door the way you leave a window cracked in autumn. Not closed, but not making promises about the weather. I arrived home in the early evening. The house was quiet in its familiar way. I hung my coat, the good navy one, on the hook by the door, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment, and I thought, this is what it feels like to come back to yourself. It was enough. The summer after everything resolved was the best summer I'd had in years. I know that sounds like something people say, but I mean it literally. I measured it in specifics, the way I have always measured things. I slept 7 hours a night without waking. I lost 4 pounds without trying, which my doctor attributed to a reduction in chronic low-grade stress that I hadn't fully acknowledged I was carrying. I cooked real meals again. Not soup, not toast, not the provisional food of a woman in crisis, but actual dinners that took effort and tasted like I was worth the effort. I replanted the entire kitchen windowsill with herbs. The rosemary came in beautifully. Carol and I resumed our lunches, which had become less frequent during the preceding months, and added a walking habit. Wednesday mornings, 6:30, 2 miles along the river path before the day got complicated. I joined a book club at the library, which I had considered for years and never done, and discovered 3 things. That I had strong opinions about fiction, that other women my age had equally strong opinions, and that disagreeing cheerfully over a novel was one of the better ways to spend a Tuesday evening. I also took on 2 new property listings that fall. Small ones, modest commissions, but I wanted to be back in the work. I had missed it. The particular satisfaction of knowing that something is what it is and is worth what it's worth, and being able to say so clearly. I referred one of the listings to a younger agent I'd mentored years ago, kept the other, and closed it in 6 weeks to a family from Ohio who cried just a little when we signed. I always liked those closings. Joan came to visit in October. She stayed 4 days and we drove out to the coast on one of them, something we hadn't done since the year after Robert died. We walked on the beach until the wind got too sharp, then sat in a diner and ate clam chowder and talked the way sisters talk, when they've stopped pretending everything is fine and discovered that the truth is more interesting anyway. I told her the whole story in full, in order, with all the details. She listened, and at the end she said, "Maggie, you know what Robert would have said?" I said I didn't. She said, "He would have said, well, naturally." Which made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in some time. Diane, my new tenant, at 412 Elmwood, proved to be exactly the kind of tenant you hope for and rarely get. Quiet, reliable, and genuinely caring for the property. When the rhododendron's root rot turned out to be more extensive than I'd thought, she called to tell me before it got worse and said she'd looked into it a little and had some thoughts if I was interested. We stood in the front yard on a Saturday morning and talked about drainage for 20 minutes, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to be. As for Daniel and Brianna, I learned things, as you do in a town where people know people who know other people, not through gossip I sought, but through the ordinary permeability of shared geography. They had moved into an apartment, a 2-bedroom across town, a significant reduction from the 3-bedroom Craftsman. The rent was, as far as I knew, market rate. They were paying for it themselves. I heard through Carol's water aerobics network that there had been friction in the marriage following the legal proceedings, that Brianna had blamed Daniel for the outcome, that Daniel had said things to her that he apparently could not unsay. I did not know if this was accurate, and I did not pursue it. What I did know, because Brianna had put it on social media, public and searchable, was that she had returned to work. The boutique she had previously worked at part-time had closed, and she had taken a position as a manager at a home goods store. From the photos, she appeared to be working long hours. She appeared thinner than I remembered. There was something in her expression in the photographs, a flatness, that I recognized not as failure exactly, but as the particular exhaustion of a person who had been running a game that has stopped working. I felt no satisfaction in this. I want to be truthful about that. There is a version of this story in which I take pleasure in her difficulty, and I am telling you that is not the version that is true. What I felt was the absence of something, the absence of the vigilance I had been carrying, the constant low-level assessment of what they might do next. Without it, I simply had my own life. Daniel called once in August, not to ask for anything, not to relitigate the spring. He said he wanted me to know that he was going to start going to therapy, that he had found someone, that he thought it was overdue. He said it quickly, like he was getting it out before he lost the nerve. I said I thought that was a wise decision, and that I was glad. He said, "I know I have a lot to account for with you." I said, "We don't have to figure that out today." He said, "Okay." There was a pause. He said, "I love you, Mom." I said I loved him too. Then he said goodbye, and I let him go, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, in the quiet kitchen, with the rosemary in the window and the late summer sun. And I felt something that was not forgiveness yet, but was the first clearing in the undergrowth that forgiveness needs before it can grow. That seemed like enough for now, so that's my story. $101,000. A Christmas door closed in my face. A withdrawal slip I almost missed in a file I almost didn't open. What I learned is this: love without limits isn't love, it's an invitation. And clarity, even when it comes late, is worth the cost of finding it. Robert used to say the truth has good bones. He was right. If you had been standing in my shoes that Christmas night on that porch, what would you have done? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here.